In this episode, we're diving into fascinating early 16th century woodcut images and priceless medieval Machzor manuscripts to see how they portray the mitzvah of blowing the shofar. We'll explore the unique details in these images that reveal interesting minhagim of the time, though some might leave us with more questions than answers. Links to the key documents under discussion can be found in the show's notes. Let's uncover the stories these images tell about our tradition. In the beginning of the 16th century, the early 1500s, there was a book that was printed in Nuremberg in Germany. To be precise, it was printed in the year 1508. And we're looking at the title page of the book right here on the screen. The book was written in Latin. I'm not going to try to read the title in Latin. Instead, I'll read the translation. Book on the Jewish Confession, which means a book about the Jewish religion, made by Johannes Pfefferkorn, a former Jew turned Christian, recently published. This is the title page of the book. Who are we referring to? We're actually referring to a rather famous individual, or an infamous individual, who lived in the 1400s and the early 1500s. Johannes Pfefferkorn, as he says here on the title page of his book, he was born a Jew. We know that his name was Yosef, but then he chose a different path in life, and in 1504, together with a wife and one son that he had, he converted to Catholicism. This book that he put out here in Nuremberg in 1508 came out again in the year 1508 in another edition in Cologne. And then, remember, Latin is only read by the clergy. There's only a small percentage, and the scholars and academics, a very small percentage of people who could read this book. So he also produced it in German, something that the masses, or at least those who would be literate, would be able to read. And that is 5 editions in 3 different cities, all in the year 1508. So this book is being pumped out in multiple editions in a very short period in time. Obviously, the Latin language is not something he was familiar with. He writes that clearly. He was familiar with German, so presumably he wrote it in the German, and the Latin was translated by someone. But interestingly, for our purposes, he included a few woodcut images in these works, and these are of the earliest woodcut images of Jewish ritual. And this made these books relevant for people who couldn't read. So he's literally covering all of his bases, because he has the Latin, he has the German, and then he has woodcut images for those who are going to suffice with the images. What is the function of this book? So he says clearly in his introduction, which we're going to read a translation in English. I have taken on the task of publishing and revealing the rite of confession practiced by the blind Jews. He continues and says, every prudent person may take note of these rites, which have no foundation, and may reject them and be in better position to show them the right way. So in other words, it's good for you to know about what Jews do, number one, so that you know to reject it, and number two, you may then be able to use this in your conversations with Jews. Knowing about Jewish practice will help you have conversations with them about showing them the light. Unfortunately, he continues, I myself was for a long time under these delusions, but I have now abandoned them and I have entered into the light. And what we're going to be looking at is that the same image he uses on the title page, it's an image that he uses from within the book, and that is an image, it's a scene of the shul on Rosh Hashanah with specifically the moment of the blowing of the shofar. And what we want to do is we want to look at this image and we want to understand what is being portrayed over here, what reflects reality, and whether we find anything interesting along the way. So the first thing we notice when we look at this image, in the text he describes the ritual of Rosh Hashanah. I'll make the image a little bigger so we can have a look. The first thing that comes to mind, or that comes to sight when we look at this image, is the blindfolds. That is, there are 9 men who are in the men's section. There are a few women in the women's section, and then there are 2 people at the entrance of the women's section. We're going to focus on the men right now, and all of them are wearing blindfolds. This shouldn't be surprising. You may recall that in the introduction, he called the Jews blind. And the truth is that this was a very common way of depicting Jews during the Middle Ages to express the fact that they don't see the light. Here is the entry in Encyclopedia Judaica under the category of ecclesia and synagoga, which is the Latin name given to a symbolic representation in Christian art that is often found in medieval Christian manuscript art. Many medieval churches also had this featured as well. Generally, it worked as follows. You had two female figures. The church is represented by one. The synagogue, the Jews, are represented by the other. The church is shown erect and triumphant, bearing a cross. The synagogue is usually blindfolded and dejected. So that is what he is showing here in this image, where all of the Yidden in this shul are depicted as being blindfolded. That's number one. Number two is let's look at the fact that everyone here is depicted with a talis. You'll look and you'll see that there's some sort of tassel that is hanging down by the men, and that is the woodcut version of a talis. Another interesting thing here is to look around at the machzorim. Who has a machzor? How many men have a machzor? So beside for the chazan, who's in the front, leaning on the stender, there are two additional men who have a machzor. And this is something we spoke about in previous classes. This is the early 1500s. Books are still rather expensive. The printing of machzorim, I don't know how many had occurred by this time, but it's definitely reasonable that not every Jew in a shul on Rosh Hashanah would have had a machzor because it's before, although the printing press existed for a few decades, it's relatively speaking new, and so that's another noteworthy factor. Now, what's happening is that at the bima in the middle of the shul is the scene of the shofar blowing, and on the right-hand side there is a man who's standing holding the shofar, and on the left-hand side there's a man sitting. There's a man sitting and he's holding some stick in his hand. His right hand, he's holding something that looks like a stick. What is that stick? We'll come back to that in a moment. But the other thing I want to talk about now is the standing versus sitting, because everyone in the sanctuary of the shul here is standing, including the Baal Tokeya. Looks like he is standing. The 9 men, or 8 of the men, are standing with the exception of one. That is on the left-hand side of the bima. There is this individual blindfolded, holding that stick, and he's sitting in a rather ornate type of chair, gesticulating with his left hand toward the Baal Tokeya. So what we want to know is what is up with the standing versus the sitting. So let's read his text, and let's see what Pfefferkorn writes when he describes this scene. He says, "Then the parchment," meaning the Torah scroll, "is rolled up again, and the rabbi sitting by the altar," meaning the bima, "holds the heavy scroll resting on his right arm." So he describes over here the rabbi sitting by the bima, holding the Torah scroll. So maybe, although that stick is probably a pretty bad job at doing a Torah scroll, but maybe that was the original attempt. I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows. I haven't seen anything persuasive about it, but that's the best bet given the text that we have accompanying the image. Next, the person who is in charge of blowing the horn comes up and stands devoutly beside the altar. So the Baal Tokeya comes up. He continues and says, "The rabbi who sits by the altar with the scroll says, 'Blow your horn.' And so it is done." What does he say over here? 2 separate times he goes out of his way to say that what we call the makri, the person who guides the Baal Tokeya in the tekiyas, and remember the common custom is to be a literal makri, which means to call out tekiya, shvarim, teruah by voice, not just by the finger. He's saying over here that the makri, who is the rabbi, is sitting. Now that's very interesting because everyone else is standing, and in fact the custom today I think is pretty common for everyone to be standing during tekiyas, at least in Ashkenazi Jewish communities. So our question that we want to know is this bidiyuk? Is this intentional that everyone is standing? However, the makri is the only one who is sitting. Okay, so with that, let us go to the handout and let's look at the sources that discuss this particular issue. The Mishnah in the 4th perek of Rosh Hashanah discusses the blowing of the shofar. Says the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah as follows: Ha'ever lifnei ateva b'yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah. When the chazan goes to lead the davening on Rosh Hashanah, Hasheni maskia. There's one chazan for shachris. There's another chazan for musaf. When do we blow the shofar in the Shemona Esrei? Not during shachris, but only during musaf. This is a sample passage of the 4th chapter of Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, which gives you a very simple takeaway. Whenever the Mishnah talks about blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, it's always in Musaf. That's what it is. It's always in Musaf, specifically the Chazaras Hashatz of Musaf. That is where the shofar blowing is happening. If the only text you had is the Mishnah, you didn't have any other text, that's the only shofar blowing you would know is that it's happening in Chazaras Hashatz, specifically where? Specifically in Musaf. Comes the Gemara, however, and the Gemara adds a layer to this. Says the Gemara, Meseches Rosh Hashanah Daf Tezayin, Lama Toikinu Marian Kishahin Yoshvin. How come we have the custom? The Gemara takes it as a given. Why do we have this custom? That we sound the shofar when we're sitting, but then we don't suffice with that, and then we blow again when we're standing. This is in order to confuse the satan. We'll come back to these words, la'arvev hasatan, in a minute, but what do you see over here? You see over here that there was a common custom already in Talmudic times to add a layer. Not only to blow the shofar the way it's in the Mishnah during Chazaras Hashatz, but kishahin yoshvin. Kishahin yoshvin means not during any Shemana Esrei, and so everyone could be seated, and was seated. And the Gemara wants to know, why are we doing this extra layer? So the answer is, in order to confuse the Satan. What does it mean, in order to confuse the Satan? So Rashi right there explains the meaning. Kedei la'arve, this means shalo yastin, that this Satan will not choose to fight against us and to make allegations against us. Why? When he sees that the Jewish people are demonstrating a love and a care for mitzvahs. How? Because not only do we suffice with the bare bones of the mitzvah by Chazaras Hashatz, but we added an additional layer by doing Tkiyas again. When you're doing it again, it means you love it so much. Mistasmin dvarav. So then he realizes he has nothing to say about alleged wrongdoings for the Jewish people. Farkeret, look how loyal the Jewish people are, and so therefore we have this custom of doing it an extra time. Now, this is the information we get in the Gemara, and if this is all the information we would have, we would walk away saying that there's this moment before Musaf, we know it's after Shachris, before Musaf, where the shofar is sounded, and everyone is sitting. There is no information about anyone standing by this earlier Tkiyas. The later Tkiyas says clearly in the Gemara, Kishahem Oindim, that's by Chazaras Hashatz. So the Gemara assumes that the people are standing, but by the earlier one, everyone is sitting. However, as we move into the era of the Rishonim, we see that this was no longer the case. And we start seeing the Rishonim talk about the fact that at least the Baal Toikeya, the one who's blowing the shofar, needs to stand during the Tkiyas de Miyushav. So we're going to look at the Tur. The Tur, writing sometime in the 1300s, he's the son of the Rosh, Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim, and Erechaim Simin Tov Kuf Pei Hey, he writes as follows, and he's clearly talking in context here about Tkiyas de Miyushav. V'oimid hatoikeya litkoya. He has to stand up. Shatzarech sheyit kamu umad. Why do you have to do it standing? The Gemara speaks about this whole Tkiyas as a sitting experience. So he says the following. It says about shofar blowing, Yom Teruah Yelachem, it's going to be a day of sounding the shofar. But the key word here is lachem. And we have a lachem by Sfiras HaOmer, because it says by Sfiras HaOmer, Usfartem lachem imacharas HaShabbos. Okay, so hold that in your head. We derive shofar from Sfiras HaOmer. Now, when it comes to Sfiras HaOmer has to be mu'umad. We know that Sfiras HaOmer has to be that we count when we're standing. Why? Because we have a pasuk that says that the Omer, you count 50 days, mehachel chermesh bakama, from when the sickle hits the standing grain. So then you have to start counting 50 days down to Shavuos. So about this we say, Al tikre bakama, ela bekoima. Don't read the word bakama, standing grain, rather bekoima, which means that we should be erect, we should be standing when we're doing the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. So we have one drasha, bekoima, which tells us Sfiras HaOmer, you need to stand. We have another drasha that tells us lachem, and so we derive that just like Sfiras HaOmer requires standing, so too shofar requires standing. So therefore, although it's called Tkiyas de Miyushav, the Baal Toikeya needs to stand by the Tkiyas de Miyushav. This is what the Tur says. Now, when you look at this, you would assume that obviously he's summarizing a Gemara. Where do you have this type of rhetoric? Where, we derive lachem from lachem, or we say, don't say bakama, say bakaima. Where do you have this type of language? Only in Chazal. After the period of Chazal, we don't find Go'anim talking like this. We don't find Rishonim talking like this. In fact, very often they say, we don't have the ability to do these types of derivations that are about extra words or parallels or hekish or gzera shava. That's something that Chazal did. Well, it turns out that none of this is in Chazal, at least no Chazal that we have. There is no Gemara or Medrash that comes from that we can establish comes from the era of the Tanoim or Amoraim that has this. It's in the sources of the Go'anim. One of the Go'anim, Rabbi Yitzchak ibn Geya, says that he received it from his teachers. And that's the first part. That's the Sfiras HaOmer, Bakama and Bakaima derivation. And then you wait for the Tkufa of the Rishonim, and that's where some said, hey, well, for Sfiras HaOmer, then carry it over, Lachem, Gzeira Shava. And other Rishonim said, 1 second, we're in this business of making Gzeira Shavas? We don't do that. But the reality is, this was the long-standing minig, and this is the Baal HaTurim's reason. The Baal HaTurim's reason is this. Now, what's really interesting is that, remember, we're talking about Tkiyas D'Miyushav here. Tkiyas D'Miyushav is not even the mitzvah. Even if his argument is right, okay, so you need to stand by Tkiyas D'Mu'umad. But Tkiyas D'Miyushav is just to show chibub mitzvah, it's just to show that you love the mitzvah. Great. Sfiras HaOmer teaches you need to stand by Sfiras HaOmer. It also teaches you need to stand by Shofar, but the real mitzvah, not this. But for some reason, no. The Baal HaTurim felt that we're going to derive from here that we even need to stand by the Tkiyas D'Miyushav. The Lavush, Ramard Chayafe, writing in either the 1500s or the early 1600s, he takes a different approach of why the Baal Takeya needs to stand. He doesn't want to rely on this derivation because, again, for him, Tkiyas D'Miyushav is not the mitzvah. So why it doesn't make sense to derive it for the non-mitzvah. So he gives a different reason. The Lavush says the reason why the Baal Takeya needs to stand is Mishum Kavod HaTzibur. That's the reason. V'hakol yoishvin. But the congregation sits. Why? And it's not just you could sit. You're supposed to sit by the first tkiyas, by the tkiyas miyusha. Because this is not the mitzvah. How do we remind ourselves, or how do we remind everyone, that the main mitzvah is done during Shemana Esrei? By the fact that we all sit by the tkiyas miyusha. That's how we make this information clear. This is why it's not only a heter, but it's a great idea to sit. But the Baal Takeya, that's not respectful. You're in service for the public, you're doing something for the tzibur, and you're going to be sitting. It doesn't look nice. So this is his approach. Very different from the Torah's approach. But he doesn't throw out the Torah's approach. He says the Torah's approach applies for Tkiyas D'Mu'umad during Chazaras HaShatz. So obviously the Chazan is standing because it's his Shemana Esrei. What about the congregation? Is the congregation allowed to sit then? No! That's where you make this limud. Bakama, bakaima, lachem. Everyone needs to stand during the Tkiyas D'Mu'umad for this reason. Okay, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that when we come to this, we have this period, we have sources. One of the Rishonim, the Torah, one of the early Achronim, the Lavush. They're talking about what? During Tkiyas D'Miyushav, who stands? Only the Baal Takeya. And in fact, when we look at all of the sources during the period of the Rishonim and well into the period of Achronim, that seems to be the reality. That seems to have been the universal custom, at least when we look at the sources. The only one standing during the Tkiyas D'Miyushav, during the first set of Tkiyas D'Miyushav, was the Baal Takeya, which is not what Pfeffer Korn's image of the early 1500s was showing us. Okay, but let's continue digging. In Tov Shem Mem, there was for the first time, an important sefer that was printed. And this was the Shalos Teshuvos Magidos, which is the Pri Megadim Shalos Teshuvos. It was a manuscript till Tov Shem Mem. It was published for the first time then. He lived in the 1700s, and he was the rabbi of Lvov. He was nominated to be the rabbi of the Jewish community in Lvov in the 1770s. And in one of these tshuvas, in Tshuva Kuf Ches, he writes as follows. He writes the following story. Poi Lvov, here in Lvov, the Beis HaKnesses Michutz Le'ir, in the shul that's outside the city. Lvov had a walled city. Inside Lvov, there was a very small Jewish community. Very few Jews lived there. Outside the walled city, that's where most of the Jewish community was. So he's talking about over here. They called it. Other places also do that. They called it Lvov Michutz Le'ir. That's the larger Jewish community that lived outside the walls. So and inside the walls they had their own rav. It really operated as a separate kila. So he says here in Lvov, in the Beis Knesses that's Chutz Le'ir, I was the Makre La Tokeya, and he gives you the year. in the Tov Kuf Lamed Zayin, 1776. The High Shata, this year. He's writing it in 1776. V'amruli, and the people told me, the community in Lvov said, Sheminig leishev hamakra al safsol, the custom is for the makra to sit on a bench, b'shosh makra, while he is doing his duties of the makra. V'asisi came mipnei aminig. So I did that because of the custom. Af sheroi v'nochen lamed kulam b'tkiyas miyushuv, but I didn't like it. I did it because they told me that's what to do. But really, it's appropriate for everyone to stand during the Kiyas Miyushav. As far as I know, this is the earliest source that speaks about someone saying, Kiyas Miyushav, everyone is supposed to be standing. And in Lvov, that was the custom. Everyone was standing. But they came to the rabbi and they said, we want you to be the exception. You're the makre, so you need to sit. That's the way we do it here in Lvov. So he says, come on, I don't like that. Everyone's supposed to be standing. Then he goes to say, they're claiming they have a minig. They're claiming they have a minig. Well, maybe that's not really the minig. Maybe this minig, and we know we're supposed to honor minhagim. Efsher b'shasha makre yoshev hamakre. Maybe he sits when he says tkiya. He sits. But then right away, in order to hear it standing, he jumps up right away. Could you imagine? Could you imagine this job of going up and down so many times? But he says maybe. Why? Because it so bothers him, the idea that the makre is the only one in shul who's sitting and everyone else is standing. He doesn't like it. So but he doesn't want to discount the whole minig in Lvov. So he says maybe this is really what the minig is. Beis HaMedrash, and in the Beis HaMedrash, which obviously there's a Beis HaKnesses, that's the more formal shul. Beis HaMedrash is the less formal shul. Nahakti, and here he has more control. Nahakti lamoid b'shas shani makra l'tokea. I was standing. This is what he says he wants to do, and this is what he implemented and did. So now the question we need to ask ourselves is, what he is describing, what's going on in Lvov in the 1770s, is pretty much what Pfefferkorn is showing us over here in this image. The Balabatim are coming and saying, yes, we're all going to stand, but we want you to sit. He says, I never saw that. He's been around. He says, I never saw that. What I saw growing up in the 1700s was everyone standing. So, in other words, is it possible that we have in Lvov a remnant of a custom that really is older? And maybe Pfefferkorn was actually giving an accurate portrayal. Maybe not. We don't know. But it is possible and definitely reasonable that 270 years later, in the 1770s, Lvov is saying something that was a tradition that went back, perhaps even to the 1500s, something Pfefferkorn observed where the makra is the only one who was sitting during the time of the Tkiyas. And the emes is we get a later source that says this. Reb Shlomo Zalman Geiger wrote a sefer called Divrei Koheles and was printed in the 1860s. But he's very clear that he wrote this section much earlier in the century, in the 1820s. And he says about the custom in Frankfurt that Biyameinu noyagim lamoid. The custom is to stand. But Harav Hamakri, the rabbi, who is calling out the notes, Yoshev Vishamea, he's the one, he actually sits. V'chein minig Frankfurt, this is the minig in Frankfurt. So this becomes interesting when you see something, and from a literary perspective, we only have it in the 1700s, here, late 1700s, early 1800s. But again, it obviously, when you have a literary source, it always is earlier than the literary source. The question is, how far earlier does it go? And it's possible that maybe this is something that we're seeing here, which opens a new window into a minig that may have been present in Germany at the time. Okay, that's part number one. Let's move to part number two. And that is, behind the mechitza, if we go back to the image, you'll notice that very clearly there are women that are behind the mechitza, the right-hand side. There's 1, 2, 3 women. One is holding a child, the middle one on the right-hand side is holding a child, and another one is holding a child's hand standing right next to her. So this is obviously something that makes sense. Women in shul to hear the shofar with children, that makes sense. But I want to bring this part of the image into conversation with a literary source from this period. So let's go back to the handout and look at a text from the Maharil. The Maharil is one of the most important definitely in this era, he lived in the 1300s and the early 1400s in Mainz, Germany. Very important source for halacha and minig during this period. And he addresses the issue of women and the mitzvah of shofar. And let's see what he says. He says, women are exempt from the mitzvah of shofar. That's not controversial. And the reason is because it's a mitzvah saseh shazman grama. It has to do with a specific time of the year, specifically Rosh Hashanah. And that we have this rule that women are exempt from that mitzvah. Nonetheless, he goes on that the custom in Ashkenaz was that women accepted upon themselves the mitzvah of shofar as something that they are careful about. So he continues and says, because women have accepted upon themselves this obligation, therefore, nachan adavar, it is correct, if they can figure out a way, it's leave the little children at home. Why? So that the children don't get in the way and don't disturb from listening to the shofar. Then he goes on to say, but when it comes to the men, who are obligated minhagim to hear the shofar, here he's going to be much stronger. He's not just going to say, if you could figure out a way, leave the kids home. No, he's going to be much more adamant about it for men. Do not have the little children with you at all during tkiyas. Why? Maybe you're not going to listen when you see the children playing around. When you see the children doing what children do, it may disturb you from listening to the tkiyah. And he continues. The Maharil continues. He was a Levi, so that's why he has the Segal over there. And he goes on and he says, Sheniskiva pliya be'enav. He's very surprised. Where did this terrible minig come from? A minig hara to bring these little children to Beis HaKnesses that they should hear the koil of the shofar. When it comes to the Megillah, okay, you need to bring them because it adds to the simcha. But what? We don't need simcha on Rosh Hashanah for shofar. If they're ktanim that igiu lichinuch, then mitzvah l'chancham, of course. Older children that are ready to be educated, and they're more mature, bring them. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about tignoikos. So that's a different story. So therefore, if the woman has no way of leaving the child at home, there's no one to care for the child, so then we're going to choose the worst, the best of the two bads, and that is keep the child in the Beis HaKnesses Hanoshim, in the Viber shul. Because they're not as obligated. There's a lesser chiyuv. The woman who leaves the child at home, that is even more ideal. So the Maharil would have something to say about this image. He would say, the fact that there are no children in the men's section, no little children, I grade this as a 100. I'm very, very happy with that. However, the women, all right, his preference would be that these little children wouldn't even be there. But the fact that they're there is something that he would have tolerated. And so here is another example of something that was going on then, and the image seems to reflect what Maharil wanted, at least b'di'evet, and presumably what was common, what was going on. Okay, let's go back to the screen now. During the same year of 1508, in addition to the work that was called the Confession of the Jews, the Jewish religion, he put out another work that very same year that's called Der Juden Spiegel. This is obviously in German. This came out, you're looking here at the edition that was printed in Cologne in 1508. I should clarify that these books aren't really books, they're pamphlets. They're, 20 pages, 30 pages, 40 pages. Here again, multiple editions come out. 4 editions published between 1507 and 1508 in 4 different cities in German. 3 are published in Latin. And here again, he produces woodcuts. There's multiple woodcuts. We're focusing on Rosh Hashanah. He has another one about Tashlich. He has one about Yom Kippur. We're focusing on the one on Tkiyah Shofar. And he reproduces pretty much the same image, but there are differences. So let me bring up this image a little bigger. Here you're able to see the image. It's the same number of people in the shul, the same Aron Kodesh at the front, the same 3 steps. Actually, let's put them side by side so you're able to compare compare them and contrast them. One of the differences, if you look at the far wall, is the Aron Kodesh. The Aron Kodesh in the left-hand picture is a curtain that seems to be open, which is not supposed to be the custom during Tkiyas. On the right-hand side, on top of a curtain, it looks like there are doors to the Aron Kodesh. That's one difference. Another big difference is the floor. On the left-hand side, you have a checkered floor, and on the right-hand side, which in my view is very distracting. On the right-hand side, you don't have that checkered view. The women's section, the same. It's pretty much the same. The rabbi is holding that same stick in his right hand. But all these differences, I want to focus on one. If you look really well on the right-hand image, you'll notice that the guy blowing the shofar is not standing erect. On the left-hand image, the one we looked at earlier, in the Confessions of the Jews, he looks like he's more or less standing straight, or at least it's not definitive. On the right-hand side, it's pretty exaggerated that the person blowing the shofar, this is in the Juden Spiegel, is leaning over. I'll make it a little bigger and you'll be able to see. It kind of looks like he's leaning over onto the bima. Again, here you see the rabbi gesticulating with his fingers, obviously telling him when to start, when to stop, how long his tkiyas should be, etc. So our question is, what is this business of the Baal Takeya leaning over onto the bima, especially given everything that we saw earlier about the need to stand when we're doing the tkiyas? So for that, let's go back to the handout. Let's look at text number 9, the Maharil. The same Maharil. He says, Hatoy Keya Yizar Ba'atzmoy, the one blowing the shofar should be careful. Sha'al Yishayin es Atzmoy B'shas HaTkiya, that he should not be leaning during the Tkiya. Dotzrich Aliyas moment, you have to stand. Ve'im Yismoich al Zroyoy Lahachzik Koyach HaKoil, and if you're leaning on your arm in order to sustain the power of the sound, so if you're doing that, Mekol Mokom, still, Yizar, be careful, Shalo Yismach Kokach, don't lean to such an extent that if we're going to remove the item that you're leaning upon, you're going to fall over. Now, if you just read this on your own, you'll be like, why is he saying? He says, don't lean, and then he says, but if you're going to lean, Lahachse Koyach HaKoil, but it sounds like, especially when you put it together with this image, that there was this thing, that some people had this custom. Now, what that was what? To lean, lahachzik koyach hakoil. He doesn't define exactly. What does it mean, lahachzik koyach hakoil? If you go back much later, if we go forward much later into the 19th century, back to this work, the Divrei Koheles, he writes about leaning, l'daiti toiv l'smayach zroye al davar be'ez koil tekiya. Right before that he writes, I want your tekiya to be a perfect straight sound without any bumps in it. Because if you have bumps in it, it's going to sound a little bit like a trua. I don't want it to sound at all like a trua. So I want you to have a perfect balanced tekiya. What happens if a person has a little bit of a shake in their hand and their arm? So there may be a little bit of a bounce. So he says that's why it's a good idea to lean. It's very possible. We don't want to bring evidence from the 1800s if we could avoid doing that. If we could from the 1400s. It's very possible that's what Maharil means when he says lahachzik koyach hakoil. It's to sustain the tkiya, that it shouldn't be bumpy. I can't say that's for sure what he means, but it's possible this is what he means. But either way, you see that there were people who were doing this. Maharil therefore had to come and caution the people not to lean too hard. Whether this guy's leaning too hard or not, I don't know. I leave that to you to decide. But all of a sudden you realize that this image, something that we would maybe look at it and ignore and say, he's writing this for non-Jews, what could it teach us? Well, suddenly we realize it actually could teach us something about the minhag. The picture clarifies the literary sources. The literary sources can sometimes clarify things for the picture. Does that mean that everything in these images or the others are true and accurate? Obviously not. You need a case-by-case analysis for these types of things. Okay, now let's move forward back to the images. A few years ago, there was this is 200 years, let's put a pfefferkorn aside now, and let's move back about 200 years earlier. So in 2021, there was big headlines were made about the fact that a medieval Machzor sold for $8.3 million at a Sotheby's auction. Okay. The entire manuscript is not available online. It's not like you can go and view the whole thing. But parts, when they put it up for auction, they put up select pages, which we're going to look at right now. Here is the page of the Tkiyah Shofar. On the right-hand side, you have the end of Kriyas HaTorah for Rosh Hashanah. And then on the left-hand side, you have the Bracha, which is actually a different nusach. They say V'tzivanu lishmoya b'koil shofar, which was some Rishonim endorsed that lashon of the bracha. Then you have the Shechiyanu, and then you have two images. So let's look a little closer to see what these two images are. This Machzor is dated to sometime, no one knows for sure, sometime in the early 1300s. Roughly is when this would have been written in the area today that we call Germany. On the right-hand side, you see the rabbi. The rabbi is holding what looks like actually a decent Sefer Torah in his right hand, and he's gesticulating with his left hand. So in other words, this is the Makri. This is the Makri holding the Sefer Torah, and he is seated. We're not surprised to hear that he was seated, because probably during this tkufa, going back to the 1300s, probably everyone besides for the Baal Tokeah was seated. If you go to the left-hand side, we have the Baal Tokeah. The Baal Tokeah is wearing that famous Juden hut, that Jewish hat that looks like a cone that Jews were supposed to be wearing at this time by law. But what's most interesting, and what is going to be our focus from now through the end of this year, is the fact that it looks like the Baal Tokeah has one leg picked up and it is resting on some type of stool. That is obviously highly unusual. Now this is at the area of the Tkiyas, the Miyushiv. But then when we go to the Chazaras Hashatz, we have where we sound the shofar again, specifically 3 times for Malchus, Zechronis, and Shofars. In this Machzor, the name for this Machzor, by the way, is the Luzzato Machzor, and that's because it was in the property of Shmuel David Luzzato, a man of the 1800s, for quite a while. And so that's why it's known as the Luzzato Machzor. I'll use that term. So the Luzzato Machzor, after Malchus, Zechronis, and Shofars, presents additional images. Here is the image after Malchios. Once again, here the person is wearing that conical hat. There is also the animal face instead of the human face, which is something we discussed at great length in previous classes, so we're not going to go back to that today. What we care about is this man has one foot on a stool as he's blowing the shofar. Let's move on to Zechronos. Here we have a man in a talis with one foot perched up on some sort of stool with a fancy background. That's at the end of Zechronos. And we go to Shofars, and we get an image here as well of a man who has his leg up again on a different type of stool after Shofars. Behind the man, it looks like there is an animal that is stuck in a branch. That is probably depicting the story of the Akedah. Remember, we use specifically a shofar from a ram because we want to invoke the schus of Akedas Yitzchak, so it wouldn't be so surprising to see a depiction of part of the story of the Akedas Yitzchak behind this individual. I'm not saying that's the only interpretation of this image, but I think it's a pretty good one. All right, so the Luzzato Machzor has 4 images of Tkiyah Shofar at all of the 4 key places of blowing of the shofar, and each time the Baal Tokeah, is depicted in this highly unusual manner. Now, if this were just this manuscript, that would be itself would warrant some sort of explanation. But the truth is, it's not just this Machzor. When we look at other medieval Machzorim from Ashkenaz, we actually find this in numerous places. Here is a Machzor that's at the Bavarian State Library in Munich today. Late 13th century, early 14th century, same general region and time. And on the left-hand folio, you're able to see this is the end of Malchias in Chazaras Hashatz, and at the end, at the left-hand side, you're able to see a Jew with that Jewish hat, and he is sounding the shofar with a leg on a stool. Here, make it a little bigger so you'll be able to see it. Let's move along. Here is another manuscript. This is in Hungary at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, manuscript 8388. This is dated earlier to the late 1200s. Here we're at Tkiyas de Miyushiv. Tkiyas de Miyushiv are listed on the right-hand side of the page. On the left side, it looks like an image of Satan. The right-hand side is a Baal Tokeah, and his foot is on a stool as well. So let's make it a little bigger. On the left-hand side, you see this really scary image, multiple toes, pretty scary wings and horns in all types of directions. We already saw in the Gemara, the reason we blow the Tkiyas de Miyushiv is Kedei la'arvev hasatan, is in order to confuse the Satan. Not surprising to find some image invoking that near the Tkiyas. On the right-hand side, we have this Jew who's red in the face. from blowing the shofar. I love that red sign on his cheek. And he is leaning his right foot on a stool as well. I'll show you one more example right now. This is actually from a siddur, which means it only has the private tefillis of Rosh Hashanah, does not have any of the piyutim, no chazaras hashatz over here. But at the opening of the Shemona Esrei for the davening of Rosh Hashanah, this is in Cambridge University Library today, same time, same general era, and same region. And on the left-hand side, you see over here an individual whose right foot is picked up on some sort of block as he blows the shofar. What is going on over here? Why do we have this artistic theme in so many of the Machzorim of Rosh Hashanah during this period? So let us turn to the literary sources. So let's go back now and look at text 11. Text 11 is the Sefer HaMinhagim for Reb Isaac Tirna. Reb Isaac Tirna is like the next generation of what the Maharil does in his generation. Reb Isaac Tirna does in the next generation. He documents the customs throughout the year. He lived sometime during the 1400s, and he writes as follows: V'oimid shliach tzibur, the chazan stands, u'mavarech l'shmaya kol shofar, and he makes the two brachas, and shechiyanu bebeis hayam, in both days he makes this bracha. Now, in the minhagim of Reb Isaac Tirna, from the first printings of the Sefer, there's Hagois HaMinhagim. Hagois HaMinhagim is that someone, and it probably wasn't only one person, it was multiple people, added things. So it's for the first few years when this comes out, it's a living document, and other individuals add things. These other individuals lived in the early 1500s. There's a few names that are associated with this. We don't need to get into that. He goes on, the Hagois HaMinhagim says, why do you need a stand? Because we derive lachem from Sfiras Omer. That's why, even though it's Tkiyas de Miyushev, nonetheless, you need a stand. He says the exact same thing the Torah says. Then, the Hagois HaMinhagim goes on to say, Im hemid ragloi al safsol katan, if you're putting your foot on some sort of small bench, ein lahamid b'choizik, don't push too hard. Ela b'inyan zeh, needs to be done in such a way that afim yenata la sasal mitachsav, even if the bench is going to be removed, ein noi noifel, you are not going to fall. V'im lav puzzle, and if not, it's puzzle. In other words, he almost seems to be saying he's disqualifying the shofar blowing, because it means you're not standing if by removing the stool the person is going to fall. Here we have where it seems people are doing this. People are doing this. This is not just something that's being written. Is this actually a custom that's happening? Yes. Now, does he go along and explain why this is a custom, why this is a thing, what is the symbolism of this? No, he doesn't do any of that. All he just does is he says, oh, you got to be standing. Well, if you're going to be doing X, he doesn't say why anyone would want to be doing X. But if you're going to be doing X, then make sure you aren't going to do it in a way that disqualifies your tkiyas. What's interesting about this is it's very similar to what Maharil was doing. Maharil was like, you need to stand. Oh, if you're going to be leaning, but at least there he said, lahachsek hakoil, so he told us why. If you're going to be leaning lahachsek hakoil, then make sure you do it in a kosher way. So Isaac Tirna is kind of doing the same thing and saying, and it's interesting that Maharil makes no mention of this. Isaac Tirna makes a mention of it, or not Isaac Tirna. The Hagois HaMinhagim in Isaac Tirna makes a mention of this, says if you're going to be doing this, be sure that you're not leaning too much. So were Jews doing this? Yes. Why? We still have no clue. Okay, so let's go back to Sotheby's. Their catalog, they explained, they discussed many aspects of the Luzzato Machzor. So they wrote as follows. Scholars have proposed various possible interpretations of this custom, ranging from the practical, so that the blasts would be more easily heard by the congregation. That's a very difficult explanation. I tried blowing the shofar standing regular. I tried with one foot on a stool. I wasn't able to tell, and the people in the room were not able to tell any difference in terms of how the sound was carrying. But then they go on to say that there's a mystical explanation. What's the mystical explanation? So that the evil forces that reside in the earth, according to some rabbinic sources, not interfere with the blowing of the shofar. So what is the explanation they're giving? They're saying that in the earth there are some evil sources, and this says in rabbinic sources, and we don't want your feet basically to be on the earth because it's going to interfere with the blowing of the shofar. Where is this coming from? So let me tell you as follows. Let's go back to this Yerushalmi. There was a scholar by the name of Ernest Roth. He wrote about this in the 1960s, and he's the one who suggested this idea of the evil forces in the earth, and he cited the following Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi here is talking about Shimon ben Shattach. And Shimon ben Shattach, there was a big witchcraft problem in his day, during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, and Shimon ben Shattach basically hires a police force of rabbis that are going to come and arrest these witches. So he's talking to them and prepping them before they make their invasion. And he says, "V'chiva in the asun alalin." And when we come upon these witches, kol chad v'chad mincha, and every single one of you, yigoif chada, you gotta tackle one of them, v'yitalteline min ara, and lift these witches off of the earth, lift them off of the ground. Why? Why is it so important to get these witches quickly off of the ground? To iske dahadein charasha, because the nature of witchcraft is taltal nase min ara lo yachel avad klum. If they're taken off of the ground, they don't have the ability to do anything. Where does a witch derive? Where does kishuf, witchcraft, derive its power? It's from being tethered to the ground. So therefore, the first thing we get in there, we don't want them to have any power over us. We need to lift them up, get them off the ground, and then you zap them from any koyach. So Roth wanted to say, so that's what's happening over here. So you see, there must be these negative energies in the ground. So much so that if you want to do witchcraft, you need to be tethered to the ground. And so therefore, maybe we don't want the negative energies associated with the blowing of the shofar, because somehow that could harm the blowing of the shofar. And so therefore, you lift one foot off the ground. This is difficult. This is very difficult. If that's the reason, then lift both feet off of the ground. Why would you only have 1 foot off of the ground? Also, at the end of the day, you need to be able to have some sort of literary source linking this, to draw from this Yerushalmi and to turn this into a minhag. The Yerushalmi doesn't talk about shofar at all. So to draw from the Yerushalmi, so what does he say? He says, yeah, but we do talk about Satan with shofar, like there is like the Satan, it's part of the conversation, and so therefore maybe Satan kishuf. I don't know. I think the difficulties in here are pretty apparent. Okay, so there was another scholar who looked at this, and his name is Rabbi Daniel Sperber, and he has a svarim that are called Minhagim Yisrael. And he pointed to a Maharil, and he said that maybe this Maharil, who we've mentioned multiple times already in this class, maybe he's the solution to this problem. Text 13 in the handout. What does the Maharil say? The tzarich lahapoich pi hashofar lamayla. You need, when you're blowing the shofar, so the opening of the shofar needs to be facing upward, facing the ceiling. Shouldn't be facing the right, shouldn't be facing the left, certainly you shouldn't be facing down. You need the shofar to be facing upward. Mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says, Allah leikim bisruah. This is a pasuk in Tehillim, where our minhag is to read this kapitel before the tkiyas, and it says, Allah leikim bisruah. What does it mean? It's a little bit of a vague pasuk. What does it mean when we say, Allah leikim bisruah? Rashi's interpretation is that bisruah, when we blow the shofar, Allah leikim, God is. What does it mean God rises? God rises means God is praised. God is praised when we blow the shofar. There's other pirushim. For example, the Even Ezra has an interesting pirush, that it's talking about a moment that's going to happen in the future. The moment in the future when the Aron that is buried deep beneath Har HaBayis is going to be taken up. So then we're going to say Allah, and there's going to be sounding of the shofar at that moment. So we're going to call the Aron Elikim, because that's where Hashem resides. So Allah Elikim Bisruah. I'm giving you these two samples to show there's a range of interpretations, even amongst the Pashtanim, how to understand Allah Elikim Bisruah. But the main thing is, what's the Maharil saying? The Maharil is saying that, look, Allah means go up. So let's therefore invoke the going up. How do we invoke the going up? We invoke it by making sure that the opening of the shofar is facing upward, not to the right, not to the left, and not downward. So here you see the pasuk Allah Likim Bisruah was used for in a real physical manifestation, in an actual practical custom. So says Rabbi Daniel Sperber, if you're using that pasuk to guide how you're going to shape the shofar. Maybe you'll use that pasuk to guide how you'll shape your posture. That you want to have a posture of going up. So what is going up? You want to sound the shofar by like on a staircase, where it's like looks like going up. Now you don't have a staircase in the middle of a shul, so you make a staircase, but you bring in a stool and you put one foot on the stool and one foot not. It looks like now you're in an upward motion, and so therefore maybe that was the reason for this particular custom. This is his explanation. The thing is, I was wondering, what's still shver is, why did none of the sources say that? In fact, all the sources quote this ma'aril, that it needs to be upward because Allah lekim b'sruah. So you might as well mention, if there's a living, breathing minhag of bringing a stool in and say, and that's also why we bring a step in. The lack of any explanation amongst these amongst any of these sources is quite interesting. And remember, Isaac Tirna, the Hagois of Isaac Tirna, all he said is, if you're doing it, he didn't even endorse it or anything like that. And so therefore, it's a little bit bizarre. Is there something else? But in addition, there's more questions I want to ask. And this question we'll do by introducing the final manuscript. And this one is also going to, as you're going to see, is going to be perhaps the key to another possible explanation. This manuscript is from the 14th century. It's at the Austrian National Library in Vienna, Codex 174. And here you see the Avinu Malkeinu, which means it's the end of Shachris. The end of Shachris. Let's zoom in to the bottom of the left-hand page, where it says as follows. Umaitzi Sefer Torah, you're going to take the Sefer Torah out, v'koirin, v'Hashem pakad asara, and you read the kriya of the first day of Rosh Hashanah as Hashem pakad asara, v'toikin, and then you blow the shofar, and he has over there the siman for the different kiyas, and then he has interesting words, ta'ayin, the last word on the line, ta'ayin, check out, be'ever acher, on the other side, v'timtza takeh, and you'll find the Baal Takeh. This is really interesting. You want to see the Baal Takeh, turn to the next page. So we're going to follow what this scribe is guiding us to do, and we're going to turn the page to the next page. What do we have here? Musaf. We have here Musaf. And specifically in Musaf, the Chazaras Hashatz of Musaf is presented here, and on the top right, we have an image of someone blowing the shofar. Once again, as is common, no facial features. This is part of the whole question of are you allowed to draw faces, which relates to the animal faces that we saw before. Let me zoom in and let's look a little closer at this image. There's a man, he's blowing the shofar. And once you're not surprised, one of his feet is on a stool. He's wearing a talis. On top of him to the left, it says Sanegar. That's the defense. The Sanegar is the malach that defends the Jewish people. He's drawn as an angel with a wing. And it says Sanegar. Next to that, it says Kategar in small at the top. You see where it says Musaf? On top of that, it says Kategar. Kategar is the one, the prosecuting angel, who alleges faults in the Jewish people. And in fact, all you can see is a hand sticking out from the Kategar. It's possible there was once a Kategar drawn there, but it was erased. It looks to me like it was erased, and someone wrote Musaf over there. And right under that is where you have the shofar. What is the job of the shofar? The job of the shofar is to silence the Kategar and to allow the Sanegar's voice to be heard. Another way of saying it is, the Kategar tries to get in the way and not allow the shofar's voice to be sounded, and the Sanegar comes to defend. Okay, so this is the shofar scene that we have. On the right and the left you have animals over here, but the question is this just random art, grotesques, or is this something intentional? I'm going to go with the assumption that this is not part of the scene, and these are just grotesques that are there for artistic flourish, which is very common in medieval Jewish manuscripts. Okay, here's the thing. When you move, this is where, right in the beginning of Shemona Esrei, on the previous page is where you had Tkiyas de Meyushav. The scribe told you, you want to see the Baal Takeh, right? Turn the page, you'll see the Baal Takeh. Fine. Now we scroll along to Malchiyas, Zichronis, Shofars, and it's the same manuscript. We have here a wonderful image of a shofar blowing. There is no stool. There is no stool. This is the end of Malchiyas. There's another image of a Baal Takeh. There is no stool. Then you continue and you go to the end of Zichronis. While there is somewhat of a raised foot, there is no stool. So what's going on over here? How come, if there is really a custom, which is our assumption now, if there really is a custom to use a stool, and in fact we saw in the Hagoyos HaMinhagim there was. So if there's a custom to use a stool, why do you have it in one place and not have it in another place? So for these reasons, we want to think that maybe there's another solution that's going to be helpful for solving this particular problem. A number of years ago, there's this machzor that came out, Oitzer Harishonim. This was put out, the Rosh HaMachon that put out this machzor, his name is Rabbi David Holzer. Tafshin Ayin Vav. So about 8 years ago when he puts out this machzor. And he addresses this issue, and he suggests a third solution to this enigma. In this manuscript itself, he points to another image later on, where it says in the text, Noisim la'ayin noisim l'chal hashamayim. We raise our eye to you in heaven. Right next to that, there's an image of a Jew wearing his Jew hat, looking up to heaven. Now, we need to ask, is there a custom when reading this particular passage that everyone lifts up their eyes to heaven? The answer is no. What is the artist doing here? The artist is picking up on a word and saying, oh, there's a word of lift up to heaven. Okay, let me make a literal depiction of this idea. This is not random. This is actually something that's very, very common in medieval Jewish manuscripts, where they'll look at a word and they'll say, oh, I see that word. Let me put in this idea, irrespective of what Jewish behavior is. Let me put in an image that conveys that particular word. Let's go through a few examples quickly. This is the Worms Machzor from the 1280s, National Library of Israel. And at the opening of Shachris of Yom Kippur, by the Yoitzris, where the text says, Sharei Rachamim, gates. Gates, what did the artist do? He put here a gate. What's the artist doing? All he's doing is saying, look at that word, let me depict that word, and so he gives an elaborate city gate type of scene. Let's move over to Pesach, because there's just so much more options in art when we go to Haggadahs, and you'll see the same theme. In this Haggadah, which is known as the Hilik and Bilik Haggadah, which is all these manuscripts are from the same region and from pretty much the same era. The text says, you have to see yourself as if you left Mitzrayim. The artist puts here an image of a man looking into a mirror. You need to look at yourself. Now, if we would come and say, well, does that mean there was a minhag in Ashkenaz to pull out a mirror by B'chol Davar Dar Chayavas Liris Atzmai? No, it's just that he's using the words Liris Atzmai, and he has a cute way of conveying the idea of looking in a mirror. This is not the only one. There is another manuscript that is known as a Shaken Haggadah. Today it's in a private collection, and same idea, though it's harder to see. Right next to the words Kilu Yatzim and Mitzrayim, there is a dude looking into a mirror. Let's go to another one. Tzei Ulamad from the Haggadah. Tzei Ulamad. This is known as the Washington Haggadah from the 1400s. Tzei Ulamad. The reason it's called the Washington Haggadah is because it's part of the Library of Congress has this Haggadah. So Tzei Ulamad. What did the artist, whose name was Rabbi Yoel ben Shimon, what did he put in? He put in a guy who is doing tzei, has his walking stick, he has his walking shoes, he has his walking bat, he's going out. Why? Because it says tzei, go out. Now, is there a minhag to walk out and to go on a hike during this part of the Haggadah? No. But because the word said say, he put an image of someone going out. Last example, and this is known as the Rothschild family Haggadah, by the Chacham Ma'u Omer, the image of the Chacham is a guy pointing to his nose. It's not entirely clear what's going on over here, but one of the theories is that in the passage Chacham Ma'u Omer, there is the word Va'af Ata Emor Loi. Va'af means you should also tell him. Some have suggested that Va'af also means nose. And so maybe the artist says, oh, we have the word here, Va'af. Let us put a picture of a guy pointing to his nose. Should we say that there is a custom to point to your nose at this point in the Haggadah? No, because that's not what is happening here. So Rabbi Holzer brings some of these examples to bring out a basic point. What is the basic point? That in some of these manuscripts, what happens is you need to look at a word. And you look at a word, and if the word on the page is matching the image, then that may be the best explanation for the image. Well, what is the word on this page? This page, we're back to this Vienna Machzor, and there is the image on the top right of the individual blowing the shofar. But let's remember, this is the beginning of Chazaras HaShatz for Musaf. And there's the Magain. The Magain is the piyutim that you say that starts with the word upad, and that's what's said during the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. On this very page, on the left-hand side, Na'ale Shofar. Na'ale Shofar im Tachnon. On the left-hand side, the last two lines, you should be able to see it. Na'ale Shofar im Tachnon. Here's the text from the Machzor that we use. Na'ale Shofar im Tachnon, translated here as, may the sound of the shofar together with our prayers ascend to Hashem. This is what this is saying, and this is the end of the mugging, toward the end of the mugging. So Rabbi Holzer suggests maybe what happened over here is that the artist says, "Oh, na'ale shofar, the shofar going up, na'ale shofar." So let's make an image of shofar going up. And so on this page, the artist puts an image of a guy going up with a stool. Does it mean it was reflecting a custom? No, doesn't mean it was reflecting a custom. Rabbi Holzer's argument is that it just means that he was picking up on a word. Now, not that the guy here in Vienna is the first one to do this. We don't assume that we have the first manuscripts of the sort. There were probably earlier ones, and those earlier ones may have actually been closer to the word. This is a little further from the word. But what does this get you? This would explain why you have it here and why you don't have it in Chazaras Hashat. If it's a real minig, then it's hard to explain why you would have the stool over here, but you wouldn't have the stool over there. If, however, it's about picking up on the word, so maybe this manuscript is a vestige of the original iteration of this art motif, and that is by the word and only by the word, because it's nothing to do with practice. It's just about depicting the word Na'ale Shofar from the beginning of the Musaf. That would explain why it's here and not in the other places. If you go back to the one in Hungary and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, this is the Kaufmann collection. You'll notice over here that on the one hand, where is this image of the guy blowing the shofar? Where is it? Yes, it's next to the tkiyas. But on the very same spread, on the left-hand side, you should be able to see in the middle of the page, Na'ale Shofar. And so maybe here too, and this is the only place in this manuscript that has this picture, maybe it's about that specific word, not about anything else, about practice. Continues Holzer and says, but one second. Isaac Turner's Hagoyes HaMinhagim speaks clearly about people doing this. And here's where he says something that's pretty bold claim. And if he's right, this is really amazing. Holzer's argument is that there was a misunderstanding. It started as an artistic motif. But after a few hundred years of being presented in Machzorim, people in the 1500s came along and said, let's do it. It seems like there's a minig, this is a thing. And so people started practicing it, which would explain why the Hagoyes HaMinhagim says, if you do this, doesn't endorse it, because none of the rabbis endorse it, doesn't explain it, because there was no good explanation for it, doesn't find meaning in it, because there was no meaning to it. It was just something people were doing. And his argument is, usually the art is supposed to reflect the practice. That's the radicalness of his claim. His claim here is that the practice was actually shaped by the art. Is there any way to prove definitively? No. That's why I gave you all three of these explanations. I gave you the first explanation about the demons in the ground, not too persuasive to me. I told you the second explanation about Allah b'shofar, that maybe this was a custom about, just like you want to have the opening of the shofar facing upward, so you want to have the general posture of Baal Takea. Reasonable explanation. However, given some of the questions that I asked, I think those are serious questions on the second interpretation. The third possibility is interesting, but I don't think there's a way to know for sure. And so therefore I leave that for you to determine which of the three is the best explanation. That's in terms of this custom. And now I just want to conclude with a medrash about the concept of Allah Elikim Bisruah. The medrash in Vayikra Rabbah says as follows. Allah Elikim Bisruah Hashem Bekol Shofar. So the medrash teaches, notices that the beginning of this pasuk says Elikim, the ending of this pasuk says Hashem. And we know that Elikim is associated with din, strict discipline and judgment, and the shame Havaya is associated with mercy, with rachamim. Says the medrash as follows. When God is Yoshev Ha'olah, rises and sits on the Kisei Din, let me translate that to English, on the day of Rosh Hashanah when there is judgment, Bidin Hu Oila. The beginning, God starts out with the Midah of Din, which explains the first two words of the pasuk, Allah Elokim. God starts out with Midas Hadin. My tam, where am I getting that? Allah Elokim Bisrua, because that's what it says. I'm not interpreting the word Bisrua. I'm just going to interpret the first two words, Allah Elokim. How to fit the word Bisrua into this is not for today. However, when the Jewish people take their shofar, and they sound it in the presence of Hashem, God rises from the posture of Din, and now he's sitting in this throne of Rachamim. Diksiv, because the second half of the pasuk says, Hashem b'kol shofar, uses the same Hashem. How did this Hashem happen? B'kol shofar, because the shofar was sounded. Therefore, we have Hashem, we have Rachamim. And it continues, umismale aleim Rachamim, says not only he's sitting on the seat of Rachamim, and he indeed becomes full of Rachamim. Okay, but that's just an emotion. What about action? Yeah, umerachem aleim, and actually executes mercy. And further, v'hoifach aleim, it's not just that Midas Hadin stays there and Hashem works through Rachamim. No, hoifach aleim Midas Hadin l'Rachamim. God then transforms Midas Hadin that it should be for Rachamim as well. All of this is grounded in the pasuk Allah Elokim B'Sruah Hashem B'Kol Shofar, which was one of the themes that we discussed over here today, which is the background for the minhag the Maharil spoke about why we need the opening of the shofar facing upward, and maybe why this interesting custom. Maybe it's one of the explanations for this interesting enigmas that we looked at today. So may it be the will of Hashem that already now in our blowing of the shofar in the month of Elul should already cause this particular outcome, where rather than Hashem interacting with us by Midas Hadin, He does so in a way of Midas Harachmim, leading to a Ksiva V'Chasim Teva.